She was a 16-year-old babysitting her friend's home when two boys she trusted plotted something far more sinister. They recorded this plan on tape, and on that tape, one of them said there should be no law against killing people. This is the shocking true story of Cassie Jo Stoddart, the Scream murder. This video covers real events involving violence and a homicide. Some details may be disturbing or sensitive to viewers. The story that follows is based on verified public information about the 2006 murder of Cassie Jo Stoddart and is presented with respect for the victim and her family. Viewer discretion is advised. Cassie Jo was a 16-year-old high school student from Pocatello, Idaho, a quiet city known for its close-knit community. She attended Pocatello High School, where she was part of a typical teenager's world: school, friends, and family. To the people who knew her, Cassie was described as responsible and kind, someone her family trusted. That trust is what led to her spending the weekend of September 22, 2006 at her aunt and uncle's home while they were away. Cassie was house-sitting for them, a normal responsibility that included watching the house and caring for the family pets. It was the kind of task many teenagers take on, and nothing about it seemed unusual or risky at the time. That house, in a quiet residential neighborhood in Bannock County, would become the setting of events that no one could have imagined. Cassie wasn't isolated or cut off from the world during this time. Like many teens, she stayed connected with friends from school. Among those in her social circle were classmates she had known through everyday school life. Familiar faces, people she had interacted with before without reason for concern. At this point, there were no warning signs, no sense that the weekend would be anything other than routine. It was simply a teenage girl trusted with a small responsibility in a familiar place, surrounded by people she believed she knew. That normalcy is what makes what happened next so difficult to comprehend. Friday evening began quietly at the house Cassie was watching. The neighborhood was calm, the kind of place where nothing ever seems to happen. Inside, Cassie wasn't alone at first. Her boyfriend, Matt Beckham, had come over to spend time with her. Not long after, two classmates from school, Brian Draper and Torey Adamcik, also stopped by. The four teenagers hung out together in the living room, watching a movie and talking like friends do on an ordinary night. Nothing about the evening seemed out of place. After a while, Brian and Torey said they were heading out. They told Cassie and Matt they were going to catch a movie at the theater. It didn't raise suspicion. Friends coming and going was normal. The house grew quieter after they left. Later in the evening, Matt received a call from his mother asking him to come home. He said goodbye to Cassie and left, expecting she'd be fine finishing the night on her own. By around 10:30 p.m., Cassie was alone in the house. Outside, the night had settled in. The streetlights glowed softly and the neighborhood was still. Inside, the house was mostly dark except for the rooms Cassie was using. Sometime later, Brian and Torey returned to the area. They went back into the house while Cassie was still there. What followed happened behind closed doors, out of sight and unheard by anyone nearby. The next day passed without anyone realizing something was wrong. It wasn't until September 24th, when Cassie's aunt and uncle returned home from their trip, that the terrible discovery was made. Cassie had been killed inside the house. The night that started with friends, a movie, and an ordinary plan to house sit had ended in tragedy, one that would soon shock the entire community. The house stayed quiet for nearly 2 days. From the outside, nothing looked unusual. The neighborhood carried on as it always did, unaware that something terrible had happened behind one of its doors. On September 24, 2006, Cassie's aunt and uncle returned home from their trip. They expected to find the house just as they left it, pets cared for, everything in place, and Cassie ready to tell them about her weekend. Instead, they walked into a scene no family could ever be prepared for. Cassie was found inside the home, and it was immediately clear something was very wrong. Authorities were called, and law enforcement arrived to secure the house and begin what would become a major investigation. The home quickly shifted from a quiet family residence to an active crime scene. Officers moved carefully through the space, documenting what they saw and working to understand what had happened during the time Cassie had been there alone. As word spread, shock rippled through the community. A teenage girl killed while house-sitting in a peaceful neighborhood was something no one could make sense of. Investigators began the difficult process of retracing Cassie's last known hours. They looked at who had seen her most recently, who had been at the house that night, and who might have information about her final evening. At this point, there were far more questions than answers. But step by step, piece by piece, the investigation was beginning. In the days after Cassie was found, investigators began with the simplest question: who had been with her that night? The answer brought them back to the same small group of teenagers who had spent time at the house that Friday evening. Detectives spoke first with Cassie's boyfriend, Matt Beckham. He described the night in a straightforward way, watching a movie, hanging out, and then leaving when his mother asked him to come home. His account established a general timeline of the evening. Then came interviews with Brian and Torey. They told police they had left earlier in the night to go to a movie at the theater. But as investigators followed up, small details began to matter. When asked about the movie they claimed to have seen, the answers were vague. They couldn't clearly describe the plot or scenes. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't proof. But it was the first sign that their story might not hold up. While interviews continued, the investigation took a major turn. Authorities were led to a location outside of town where several items had been buried and partially hidden. Among the recovered objects were dark clothing, masks, gloves, and knives. These items weren't lying out in the open. They had been deliberately concealed. Also recovered from that location was a video camera containing videotapes. When investigators examined the footage, they found recordings made by Draper and Adamcik themselves. Some of the recordings were made before the crime, others afterward. The videos showed the two boys talking to the camera, speaking directly to whoever might one day watch the footage. In one portion of the recording, one of them said, "There should be no law against killing people." The statement was not something investigators had pulled from an interrogation room. It was spoken voluntarily, recorded by the teens themselves. Another clip showed them later referring Cassie by name. In footage later described in court, one of the boys said, "We just killed Cassie." The video did not show the crime itself, but they showed the boys talking about their actions and plans in their own words. That discovery changed the direction of the case. Now investigators had teenagers who had been at the house, a story that didn't fully check out, hidden clothing and weapons, and recorded statements tying the boys to the event. With this combination of physical evidence and self-recorded footage, detectives had enough to move forward. Within days of Cassie's death being discovered, Brian and Torey were taken into custody. For the first time since the quiet house had turned into a crime scene, investigators were no longer asking only what happened. They were beginning to understand who was responsible. By the time the case moved towards court, attention turned to understanding who Brian Draper and Torey Adamcik were, and what had been happening in their world before Cassie was killed. Both boys were 16 years old, classmates of Cassie at Pocatello High School. To many around them, they didn't stand out as violent or dangerous. They were described as quiet, often keeping to themselves, and frequently spending time together. Their friendship was close, the kind where long conversations and shared interests filled hours after school. One of those shared interests was horror movies. In videos later presented in court, the two boys referenced violent films, including the movie Scream. They talked about killers in movie, about violence as entertainment, and about the idea of murder in a detached, almost casual way. These weren't heated arguments or emotional outbursts. They were calm discussions recorded by the teens themselves. In one segment of video, Brian says, "There should be no law against killing people." The statement was made before the crime occurred. It was not said during questioning or under pressure. It was spoken freely while the camera was running. Other recordings showed the two discussing plans to kill someone. According to court records, they talked about selecting a victim and referred to Cassie by name during these conversations. Reports also described a so-called death list the boys had created. A list of potential targets, with Cassie included. These conversations showed planning, not impulse. In another clip recorded after the crime, one of them is heard saying, "We just killed Cassie." The tone in the recording, as later described in court testimony, was not panicked. It was not confusion. The boys appeared aware of what they had done and spoke about it directly. There were also discussions captured on video about wanting recognition, wanting to be remembered. They spoke about how killers in movies became famous and they compared themselves to those fictional characters. Together, Draper and Adamcik reinforced each other's thinking. There was no voice of hesitation between them, no moment where one tried to stop the other. Instead, the recordings show agreement, shared ideas growing stronger the more they talked about them. What emerges from these documented statements is a picture of two teenagers who didn't describe their actions as a mistake or a loss of control. They discussed them as something they had talked about, prepared for, and recorded along the way. After their arrest in late September 2006, Brian Draper and Torey Adamcik entered the phase of the legal process most people never see. The months of legal maneuvering that happened before a jury is ever seated. This stage is called pre-trial proceedings, and it's where both sides, prosecution and defense, prepare for what will become a life-altering courtroom battle. Both boys were formally charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder. At their initial court appearances, the charges were read aloud in quiet courtroom. The words were formal, but the meaning was heavy. The state believed these two teenagers had planned and carried out the killing of a classmate. Because of the seriousness of the charges, the case immediately moved into higher-level court proceedings rather than staying in juvenile system. After charges are read in adult court, the next legal step is called an arraignment. This is the moment when each defendant stands before the judge and formally responds to the charges. In this case, both Brian Draper and Torey Adamcik entered pleas of not guilty. It's a brief moment in the courtroom. No speeches, no drama, just a clear legal position. They were not admitting responsibility, and the case would move forward to trial. That plea is what officially sets the stage for everything that follows. One of the first major legal questions was where this case would be tried. Draper and Adamcik were only 16 years old. Normally, crimes committed by minors go through the juvenile justice system, which focuses more on rehabilitation than punishment. But prosecutors argued this case was different. They pointed to the level of planning involved, the nature of the charges, the severity of the crime. The court ultimately agreed that the case would proceed in adult criminal court, meaning the possible penalties included life imprisonment. For the defense, this decision was crucial. Being tried as adults meant the stakes had changed permanently. Because the charges involved first-degree murder, the court addressed whether either defendant would be released before trial. In serious cases like this, especially where planning is alleged, judges consider the risk of flight and danger to the community. The court determined that both boys would remain in custody while awaiting trial. That meant months and eventually years of waiting behind detention facility walls as legal proceedings slowly unfolded. Another key issue was whether the boys would be tried together or separately. Because both were accused of acting together, the prosecution initially sought to try them in the same courtroom. But defense attorneys argued that a joint trial could unfairly influence the jury, especially if statements from one defendant might affect the other. The court decided the trial would be separate, meaning 2 juries, 2 proceedings, and 2 independent verdicts. This ensured that each boy's actions and words would be weighed individually under the law. Behind the scenes, both legal teams entered a process called discovery. This is when the prosecution is required to share the evidence they plan to use in court with the defense. It's a massive exchange of information. Boxes of material changed hands, police reports, interview transcripts, forensic findings, video recordings, photographs, physical evidence documentation. Defense attorneys spend months reviewing every detail, looking for inconsistencies, procedural mistakes, or anything that might weaken the state's case. This is where the case shifted from police work to legal strategy. In cases involving teenagers being tried as adults, courts often examine whether the defendant understands the legal processes and are mentally able to participate in their defense. While there is no indication that either boy was ruled incompetent to stand trial, the legal system still had to ensure they understood the charges, the courtroom process, and the consequences they faced. This step doesn't make headlines, but it's a required safeguard in serious criminal cases involving minors. Before a trial begins, defense attorneys often filed motions, formal requests asking the judge to limit or exclude certain evidence. In this case, motions were filed concerning whether certain recorded statements should be allowed in court, how evidence had been collected and handled, whether the defendant's right had been fully protected during the investigation. Each motion meant another hearing, another day in court without a jury present, lawyers standing, arguing technical points that could shape the entire trial. The judge's decisions on these motions would determine what the jury would eventually see and hear. Before trials begin, prosecutors and defense attorneys often discuss the possibility of a plea agreement, where a defendant might plead guilty in exchange for a reduced charge or sentence. In this case, no plea agreement was reached. That meant both sides were preparing for a full jury trial, where every piece of evidence and every statement would be presented publicly. Choosing not to take a plea deal raised the stakes even higher. The outcome would now rest entirely in the hands of a jury. As the case moved closer to trial, attention turned to the process of selecting a jury, a step called Voir. Because the case had drawn public attention, the court needed to ensure jurors could remain fair and impartial. Lawyers from both sides prepared questions designed to uncover bias, prior knowledge of the case, or strong opinions that might affect judgment. This preparation marked the transition from legal groundwork to the public courtroom phase. All of this happened over many months. During this time, the defendants remained in custody, families waited through hearing after hearing, prosecutors refined their presentations, defense teams prepared their strategies. The case grew from a shocking local tragedy into a fully prepared courtroom prosecution. By the time the jury selection approached, the legal groundwork had been laid. The evidence had been organized, the arguments had been shaped, and both sides were ready to present their version of the story to 12 jurors who would decide the outcome. On the morning jury selection began in the trial of Brian Draper, the courtroom looked different from pre-trial hearings. Instead of just lawyers and judge, rows of unfamiliar faces filled the benches. These were potential jurors, local citizens called in from everyday life. Some had taken time off work, others had rearranged family schedules. Most had no idea how serious the case would feel once they sat down. The judge entered and the room settled into silence. One by one, the group was sworn in. They were told this was a case involving the death of a teenager and the charges included first-degree murder. The weight of those words hung in the air before questioning even began. The process is called voir dire, a French term meaning to speak the truth. It's where lawyers ask questions to uncover bias. The prosecution went first. They asked whether anyone had already heard about the case. A few hands rose. Those people were asked follow-up questions. What had they heard? From where? Had they formed opinions? Anyone who seemed to already believe the defendants were guilty or not guilty could not stay. Next questions turned to emotions and beliefs. Do you believe teenagers should be treated differently than adults in serious crimes? Would the age of a defendant make it harder for you to find them guilty if the evidence supports it? Some jurors hesitated, some answered firmly. Each response mattered. The defense attorneys then had their turn. They focused on different concerns. Can you separate emotions from evidence? Would graphic or disturbing testimony affect your ability to remain fair? Do you believe young people are easily influenced by others? Every answer gave lawyers clues about who might lean towards sympathy, who might lean towards punishment, and who might struggle to stay neutral. After questioning, lawyers approached the judge to excuse certain jurors. Some were removed for cause, meaning a clear bias or conflict had been identified. Others were dismissed through peremptory challenges, which allow each side to remove a limited number of jurors without stating a reason. Seats emptied and refilled. The process was slow and careful. This wasn't about speed. It was about building a jury both sides believed could fairly hear the case. By the end of the process, 12 jurors and several alternates remained. They were strangers to one another. Different ages, different jobs, different backgrounds, but they now shared one responsibility: to listen to weeks of testimony, to weigh evidence, to apply the law as instructed, and to decide the fate of a teenage defendant charged with first-degree murder. They were sworn in. From that moment on, they could not discuss the case with anyone, read media coverage, or conduct their own research. Their world narrowed to the courtroom and the evidence presented inside it. The trial was ready to begin. Opening statements are not evidence. They are the first chance each side has to frame the story for the jury, to explain how they believe the pieces fit together. The prosecutor stood, walked slowly towards the jury, and began outlining what the state believed the evidence would show. They described a night that started normally but ended in a planned act of violence. They told jurors they would hear about recordings made before the crime, recordings in which the defendant spoke about killing and discussed plans in advance. The prosecution said jurors would see physical evidence that tied Brian Draper to the events and would hear testimony that showed this was not a moment of sudden panic, but a decision made ahead of time. They explained that the charge of first-degree murder requires proof of planning, and told the jury they would show that planning through the defendant's own words and actions. The message was clear. This was deliberate. This was discussed, and the defendant knew exactly what he was doing. When it was their turn, Draper's defense attorneys approached the jury with a very different tone. They did not begin by arguing that nothing happened. Instead, they focused on who Brian Draper was at the time, a 16-year-old teenager. They asked jurors to remember his age and emotional development. They suggested that teenagers sometimes say extreme or shocking things without fully understanding consequences, especially when trying to impress friends. The defense said the jury would hear recordings, but urged them not to assume that words spoken by a teenager automatically prove a fully formed adult level plan. They also suggested that Draper was not acting alone and that influence from others would be an important part of understanding his role. Their central message was different from the prosecution's. Yes, something terrible happened, but the question is not just what happened, it is what Brian Draper truly intended and whether the law's highest level of murder has been proven beyond reasonable doubt. By the end of opening statements, the jury had two competing frameworks. Prosecution, a planned killing proven by the defendant's own recorded words and later actions. Defense, a teenage boy, immature and influenced, whose words may not reflect a fully formed criminal plan. No witnesses had testified yet. No evidence had been shown. But the stage was set. The next fate would determine which story the evidence supported. The prosecutors called the first witness, the lead investigator assigned to the case. A uniformed officer stepped into the courtroom, was sworn in, and took a seat in the witness box. His role was not to give opinions, but to walk the jury through what happened after Cassie's body was discovered and how the investigation unfolded. The prosecutor began with calm, structured questions. The detective explained how law enforcement was notified on September 24, 2006, after Cassie's relatives returned home and found her unresponsive inside the house. Officers secured the home as a crime scene and began documenting everything inside. He described the early steps of the investigation, identifying who had last seen Cassie, who had been at the house that Friday night, and how those names led investigators to Brian Draper and Torey Adamcik. The detective told the jury about interviewing the two boys. He did not dramatize their behavior but explained that investigators followed up on their account of going to a movie theater. As part of the routine verification, police checked whether their story matched available information. The prosecutor then guided the detective towards the next turning point. He described how investigators were later directed to location outside town where items had been buried. The detective told the jury what was recovered there: clothing, masks, knives, and a video camera containing tapes. Each item was shown to the jury, carefully labeled as evidence. The detective explained how those items were logged, photographed, and preserved. The prosecution's goal here was simple: to establish the part of the investigation and to show the jury how evidence connected the defendant to the event of that night. The detective's tone stayed measured. No speculation, no emotional language, just a timeline of actions taken by law enforcement. When the prosecutor finished, Draper's defense attorney stood. The tone shifted. The defense focused on procedure. They asked how many officers entered the house before it was fully processed, whether every item recovered had been continuously documented, if there were moments when evidence was handled by multiple people. The defense was not arguing that the evidence didn't exist. Instead, they were probing for any possibility of error, contamination, or assumption. They also questioned whether investigators had focused too quickly on Draper and Adamcik, asking if other leads had been explored. The detective answered carefully, often referring to reports and procedures. He maintained that evidence was handled according to protocol and that multiple leads had been followed before conclusions were reached. After a brief redirect by the prosecutor to clarify a few technical points, the detective stepped down. After the lead investigator stepped down, the prosecution called a forensic evidence specialist to the stand. Unlike the detective, this witness wasn't there to talk about interviews or timelines. Their job was to explain the physical items recovered and what those items revealed. They were sworn in and began by describing their role, examining evidence in a controlled lab environment, documenting it, and ensuring nothing was altered or contaminated. The prosecutor started with the basics. Did you receive items collected during the investigation into Cassie Jo Stoddart's death? Yes. The specialist explains that the items were sealed in evidence bags, labeled with dates, times, and the officers who collected them. This is called chain of custody, a record showing exactly who handled evidence and when to ensure nothing has been tampered with. One by one, the prosecutor displayed items recovered from the buried location outside town. The specialist described dark clothing, gloves, masks, knives. They explained how each item was photographed, measured, and tested where possible. The goal wasn't to dramatize what the items were used for, just to show they existed and were connected to the case. The prosecutor asked about the video camera and tapes. The specialist confirmed that the camera and tapes were handled carefully, transferred to digital format for preservation and examination for authenticity. They testified that there were no signs of tampering with the recording. The focus remained technical: how the items were processed, how they were stored, how the recordings were preserved. No one speculated about meaning, only procedures. When the defense attorney stood, the tone shifted again. They asked whether environmental conditions, moisture, soil, time buried could have affected the items. They questioned whether any fingerprints were recovered, and if not, whether that limited certainty. They asked whether multiple people handling the evidence could create room for error. The forensic specialist answered carefully, explaining that while environmental exposure can affect evidence, procedures exist to minimize contamination. They acknowledged limits were appropriate but emphasized that standard forensic protocols were followed. The defense wasn't denying the item existed. Their strategy was to remind the jury that forensic science has limits and that not every question has a perfect answer. After a short redirect, the specialist stepped down. After the forensic testimony about the physical evidence, the prosecution called a different kind of witness. Not a detective, not a scientist, just a teenager. A young man walked to the stand, visibly nervous. He was sworn in and took a seat, glancing briefly towards the defense table before looking back at the prosecutor. This witness was a friend of Brian and Torey. He wasn't there to talk about the crime itself. He was there to talk about something that happened before it. The prosecutors kept the question simple. Did you go to a store with Brian and Torey in the days before September 22, 2006? Yes. The witness explained that the boys had asked him to go with them to purchase knives because he was able to help complete this transaction. Inside the store, he saw them select knives from display. He described one in particular, a knife with a serrated edge. He testified that Draper handled it and later indicated that knife was his. The prosecutor asked him to look at an evidence photo displayed on a monitor. Do you recognize this item? Yes, that looks like one of the knives we bought. He wasn't guessing. He described features he remembered: the shape, the serration, the style of handle. The purpose of his testimony was narrow but powerful. He established that the knives were obtained shortly before the crime. The defendants were present when they were purchased. Draper claimed one of them as his. This wasn't a weapon found randomly in a kitchen drawer. It was something deliberately acquired days earlier. When the defense attorney rose, the tone shifted. They focused on memory. Do you remember the exact date you went to the store? Had you purchased other items that day? Is it possible you are mixing up details from different trips? The defense asked whether the witness had been pressured or influenced during questioning by police. The young man admitted he didn't remember every small detail, but he remained firm on the key point. He went with Draper and Adamcik to buy knives, and Draper claimed one of them. The defense also asked whether the boys had said what the knives were for at the time. No, he answered. That answer mattered. It showed that witness could only testify to what he personally saw, not to intentions. After a brief redirect, he stepped down. When the detective returned to the stand, the energy in the courtroom had shifted. The earlier testimony had shown how the investigation began. Now, the jury was about to hear how it moved from suspicion to physical proof. The prosecutor stood a little closer to the witness box this time. Voice steady. Detective, after your interview with Brian Draper, did your investigation take you to another location? The detective nodded. Yes, it did. He described driving with other officers out of town, away from the houses and streetlights, into a more remote area. Dry ground, open space, the kind of place where something could be hidden and not easily noticed. The prosecutor asked what led them there. The detective explained that information had been provided during questioning, enough to guide them to a specific spot. When they arrived, officers began searching the area, not randomly, but where they had been directed. After a short time, they noticed disturbed soil. The detective's voice stayed even as he described kneeling beside the ground, brushing dirt aside carefully. One by one, items began to appear. Dark clothing, masks, knives, and eventually a video camera. Each item was photographed exactly where it was found before being lifted. Evidence bags were opened, labels were written, the process was methodical. The prosecutor displayed photos to the jury, not dramatic images, just earth, grass, and objects partially uncovered. Were these items later logged into evidence? Yes. And did their condition match what you saw at the recovery site? Yes. The prosecutor paused, then asked the question that mattered most. Detective, how did you know where to search? The room was silent. Brian Draper told us where to look. No raised voice, no emphasis, just a statement of fact. When the defense attorney stood, the tone changed, not louder but sharper. They asked whether Draper had been tired during questioning, whether officers had suggested locations first, whether other people could have known about that spot. The detective answered carefully. He explained that questioning followed procedure and that the information about the location came from Draper himself. The defense pressed about the outdoor setting, open land, accessible to others. The detective agreed the area wasn't fenced off, but emphasized that officers had gone directly there because of what Draper said. After a few more questions, the defense sat down. The detective stepped off the stand, and something unspoken hung in the air. The jury had now heard that the defendant didn't just know about the evidence, he knew where it was buried. The prosecution's next witness was not there to talk about the crime scene or forensic testing. Their role was narrower but incredibly important: to establish that the video recordings the jury was about to see were authentic, untampered, and accurately preserved. The witness was a digital evidence specialist, someone trained in handling cameras, tapes, and digital transfers without altering original data. After being sworn in, they explained their job in plain language. When a recording device is recovered in an investigation, it must be handled carefully so its contents remain exactly as they were when first created. The prosecutor approached the evidence table and lifted a sealed bag. Inside was the camera recovered during the investigation. The witness identified it as the device they had examined. They described how it arrived at the lab sealed, how it was logged into evidence, and how the contents were copied using specialized equipment designed to prevent any changes to the original material. The jury was told that the original tapes were preserved and all viewing was done using digital copies, standard procedure to protect evidence. The prosecutor then asked the key question: were the recordings you reviewed altered in any way? No. The witness explained that they looked for signs of editing, breaks, or manipulation and found none. The footage appeared continuous and consistent with recordings made directly by the camera. Before any video played, the courtroom slowed. The judge reminded jurors that recordings are evidence just like physical objects. They were instructed to observe carefully but not jump to conclusions beyond what the law allowed. Lights in the courtrooms were dimmed slightly so the screen could be seen clearly. The room went quiet. The recording did not show the crime itself. Instead, this showed the defendants talking to the camera. The witness did not interpret what the boys meant. Their role was only to confirm that the voices on the recordings matched the individual identified in the investigation. The date and time on the recording were consistent. The recordings had not been edited. The prosecutor paused the video at certain points to ask the witness simple identification questions. Is this the footage you reviewed? Yes. Does this accurately represent what was recorded on the device? Yes. The purpose was not drama. It was authentication. When the defense attorney stood, their questioning focused on technology. They asked whether digital transfers can ever introduce errors, whether compression or cropping affects clarity, whether background noise could make statements harder to interpret. The witness acknowledged that no technology is perfect, but explained that procedures were used to ensure accuracy and there was no evidence the recording had been changed. They clarified that the recording played for a jury were true and accurate representation of what had been captured on the original device. After days of testimony, exhibits, and careful questioning, the prosecutor stood once more. There was no new witness waiting in the hallway, no more evidence boxes on the table. The jury had heard from investigators, forensic specialists, the friend who described the knife purchase, the detective who led officers to buried evidence, and expert who authenticated the recording. The prosecutor approached the podium. "Your Honor," they said, voice steady, "the state rests." It was a simple sentence, but it marked a turning point. For the first time since the trial began, the burden shifted. Until now, the prosecution had carried the responsibility of presenting proof. Now, the defense had a choice: present its own case or argue that the prosecution hadn't proven enough. The judge turned toward the defense table. "Defense, you may proceed." Before calling any witnesses, Draper's attorney made a standard legal motion outside the jury's hearing, asking the judge to dismiss the charges on the grounds that the prosecution had not met its burden. This is routine in criminal trials, and it was denied. The judge ruled that there was enough evidence for the jury to consider. The jury was brought back in. The defense attorney rose slowly, buttoned their jacket, and walked toward the jury. The courtroom shifted again, not in volume, but in focus. The prosecution's story had been told. Now it was the defense's turn to respond. When the defense called its first witness, the mood in the courtroom changed. Instead of an investigator or technician, a middle-aged professional walked to the stand, a psychologist with experience studying adolescents' behavior and development. After being sworn in, the defense attorney began by establishing the witness's background. Years of education, critical work with teenagers, and experience explaining adolescents' decision-making in court. The goal wasn't to talk about Cassie or the night of the crime. It was to talk about how teenagers' brains work. The psychologist explained that the human brain, especially the areas responsible for impulse control, long-term planning, and risk assessment, continues developing well into the early 20s. He described how teenagers are more likely to act without fully weighing consequences, be influenced by peers, seek approval or status within a friendship, say extreme things without fully grasping their weight. The defense attorney asked whether a 16-year-old might talk about violence or shocking ideas in ways that don't reflect a mature, fully formed plan. The psychologist said, yes. The adolescents often experiment with identity, language, and boundaries, especially in front of friends, without the same level of judgment seen in adults. The witness was careful. He did not say Draper was incapable of understanding right from wrong. He did not excuse behavior. Instead, he explained that adolescent thinking is different, more emotional, more reactive, and more easily shaped by social dynamics. The defense then connected this to the recordings. They asked whether statements made by a teenager, especially in a peer setting, should automatically be interpreted as evidence of adult level planning. The psychologist responded that context matters and that teenage speech can include exaggeration, bravado, or attempts to impress others without full appreciation of consequences. When the prosecutors rose, the tone tightened. They asked whether the psychologist had ever met Brian Draper personally. No. So the testimony was general, not based on direct evaluation. The prosecutor asked whether teenagers still understand that killing someone is wrong. Yes. They asked whether teenagers are capable of planning actions. Yes. The psychologists agreed that while teenagers have development differences, they can still form intentions and understand serious consequences. The prosecutor's point was clear. Being young does not remove responsibility. After a few more questions clarifying limits of the testimony, the psychologist stepped down. The next person the defense called wasn't a scientist or an expert. It was someone who knew Brian Draper in ordinary life. A woman walked slowly to the stand, a teacher, or perhaps a family acquaintance, someone who had seen him in classrooms and hallways long before his name was spoken in a courtroom. She took the oath, sat down, and folded her hands in her lap. The defense attorney approached gently. How do you know Brian Draper? She described him as she had known him. Quiet, sometimes awkward, not a leader in any group, someone who kept to himself, who could be polite and soft-spoken. She talked about seeing him at school, how he interacted with classmates, how he wasn't known for violence or aggression. The defense wasn't asking her to explain the crime. They were asking her to describe the boy she had known, the version of him that existed before the night everything changed. Her voice trembled slightly when she said she never expected to see him in a situation like this. The defense asked whether Brian had ever shown signs of being easily influenced. She said he often tried hard to fit in, sometimes going along with others to avoid standing out. The courtroom stayed quiet. No one interrupted. The jury listened, faces still, notebooks resting on their laps. When the prosecutor stood, the tone shifted, not unkind, but precise. You didn't see Brian Draper every day, did you? No. You went with him on the night of September 22. No. You can't tell this jury what he was thinking that night. She shook her head. The prosecutors thanked her and sat down. It wasn't about attacking her. It was about reminding the jury that knowing someone in school doesn't mean knowing what they are capable of in private. The witness stepped down, eyes lowered as she walked past the jury. For the defense, the message was subtle but important. Brian Draper had not always been a name tied to a crime. He had been a student, a quiet presence, someone who didn't seem dangerous. The defense wasn't asking the jury to forget what they'd heard. They were asking them to remember that the person sitting at the defense table had a life before this, and that teenagers are not always who they appear to be in moments of pressure and influence. The defense attorney stood slowly after their final witness stepped down. The courtroom had grown used to the rhythm by now. Someone takes the stand, questions are asked, objections rise and fall, then the witnesses leave. But this time, no one new was waiting by the door. The attorney adjusted a stack of papers on the table, then faced the judge. Your Honor, the defense rests. Just like that, it was over. No dramatic finale, no last-minute revelation. The defense had chosen not to flood the courtroom with voices. Instead, they had placed just a few careful pieces in front of the jury: how teenagers think, how easily they can be influenced, how words spoken at 16 might not carry the same meaning as words spoken by an adult. The judge nodded, thanked counsel, and turned to the jury. They had now heard everything they were going to hear as evidence. From this point on, no new witnesses would take the stand. No new exhibits would be introduced. The facts of the case, at least the ones allowed inside this courtroom, were complete. What remained was interpretation. Two different sides were about to stand before the same 12 people and tell them what all of it meant. The room felt still, like a breath being held. The closing arguments were next. The prosecutor stood slowly, buttoned their jacket, and walked to the space in front of the jury box. No evidence in their hands this time, no photographs, no bags, just words. They didn't raise their voice, they didn't rush. They reminded the jury that the law required them to look at the evidence piece by piece, and then together. They spoke about preparation, about the trip to the store, about knives chosen days before the crime, not a kitchen tool grabbed in panic, but something acquired in advance. They spoke about the buried items, clothing, masks, weapons hidden away in the ground, not left behind by accident. They reminded the jury how investigators didn't stumble across the spot. They went there because the defendant knew where to point them. They spoke about the recordings. The jury had seen the device, heard the voices, watched the young men talk to a camera about killing as if it were an idea they could explore. The prosecutor reminded them. Those weren't words taken out of context by police. Those were words spoken freely, recorded by the defendant himself. Then prosecutors turned to intent. First-degree murder, they said, is about planning, about making a decision before acting. Planning doesn't require weeks. It doesn't require a written schedule. It requires a moment where someone decides to do something and then carries it out. They told the jury that movement had been proven. The knife purchase, the discussions on tape, the return to the house, the concealment afterward. Not a sudden loss of control, a sequence. The prosecutor acknowledged the defense's arguments about age. Yes, they said, the defendant was 16. But they asked the jury to remember that the law does not say teenagers are incapable of planning. It asks whether the evidence proves this defendant did. They paused, letting the room sit with that. This case is not about who Brian Draper was in a classroom. It's about who he chose to be on that night. They reminded the jury that sympathy, speculation, or discomfort could not replace evidence. Their duty was not to explain why. Their duty was to decide whether the state had proven what happened beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecutor stepped back from the jury box. The evidence shows preparation. The evidence shows action. The evidence shows concealment. And the evidence shows intent. We ask you to return a verdict of guilty. The courtroom stayed silent as the prosecutor returned to their seat. Now it was the defense's turn to give the jury a different way to see the same story. The defense attorneys didn't walk quickly. They didn't bring notes to the podium at first. They just stood there for a moment, looking at the jury. 12 people who had spent days listening to a story no one wanted to be part of. They began quietly. No one in this courtroom is saying nothing happened. They acknowledged the tragedy, the loss, the seriousness of the charges. Then they turned to the one thing they said the case truly came down to: intent. They reminded the jury that first-degree murder is the most serious form of homicide because it requires proof of a deliberate, fully formed plan, not bad judgment, not reckless behavior, not immature talk, a decision made with understanding. They spoke about age. Brian Draper was 16 years old. Not as an excuse, they said, but as context. They reminded jurors of the psychologist's testimony about teenage brains, about impulse, about the need to impress friends, about saying extreme things without fully grasping consequences. They returned to the recording. Yes, you heard them. But hearing words and understanding what they truly represent are not the same thing, said the attorney. They asked the jurors to consider whether a teenager sitting with a friend talking into a camera might exaggerate, might posture, might try to sound darker or braver than he truly was. They reminded the jury that there was no recording of a plan being written out, No detailed schedule, no checklist, only talk. Talk between two teenagers whose judgment was still developing. Then they addressed influence. They suggested that in that friendship, personalities mattered, that some teens follow more easily than they lead, that fitting in can mean going along with things you don't fully think through. The defense reminded the jury of the legal standard: not suspicion, not probability, not most likely, beyond a reasonable doubt. If there is a reasonable possibility, they said, that what you saw was the reckless, immature behavior of a teenager who did not fully grasp the reality of what he was doing, then the law requires you to consider that. They didn't ask the jury to forget the evidence. They asked them to be certain about what is proven. The attorney stepped back slowly. When you deliberate, remember, this is not a question of whether something terrible happened. It is a question of whether the state proved beyond reasonable doubt that a 16-year-old boy formed the kind of deliberate adult plan required for first-degree murder. They returned to their seat. The room felt heavier now. Only one voice remained before the jury would be sent to decide. The prosecution would stand one last time for rebuttal. Alright, this is the last time the prosecution speaks before the jury disappears to decide everything. The prosecutor stood again. But this time there was no long walk, no stack of notes, no dramatic pause. Rebuttal arguments are usually shorter, focused, direct. They faced the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, you just heard a great deal about age, about adolescence, about immaturity. They didn't dismiss it, they acknowledged it. Yes, Brian Draper was 16, and yes, teenagers are still developing. Then they shifted. But the law does not ask whether a defendant was young. It asks whether he planned, whether he understood, and whether he acted. They reminded the juror that the psychologist had agreed on one important point during cross-examination. Teenagers still know right from wrong. Teenagers can make plans. Teenagers can understand consequences. The prosecutor turned back to the evidence. They talked about the trip to buy knives days before the crime. Not words, actions. They talked about returning to the house later that night. Not exaggeration, movement. They talked about burying clothes, masks, and weapons afterward. Not teenage talk, concealment. Then they addressed the recording one last time. The defense says those were just words. But words followed by actions are not just talk. They are proof of intent. They reminded the jury that no one forced the defendant to record those statements. No one edited them. They came from him. The prosecutor's voice stayed steady. Premeditation does not require a calendar or a written schedule. It requires a decision made before an act. The evidence shows that decision was made. They stepped slightly closer to the jury box. This case is not about who Brian Draper might have been in another life. It is about what he chose to do and what he chose to say and what he chose to hide. A final pause. The defense asks you to focus on doubt. The state asks you to focus on the evidence. And when you do, the path is clear. They nodded once. We ask you to return verdicts of guilty. The prosecutor sat down. No more witnesses, no more arguments. Now the law belonged to the judge, and the facts belonged to the jury. The courtroom felt different now. No one stood at the podium. No witnesses waited in the hallway. The lawyers had said everything they were allowed to say. Now it was the judge's turn. The judge leaned forward slightly, voice steady and measured. This wasn't storytelling. This wasn't persuasion. This was the rule book. They explained that the juror's job was not to solve every mystery or answer every why. Their job was to decide whether the prosecution had proven each charge beyond a reasonable doubt. They defined first-degree murder in careful language, that it requires a killing that was willful, deliberate, and premeditated. They explained that premeditation didn't require weeks or months, but it did require proof that the decision was made before the act. They defined conspiracy, an agreement between two peoples to commit a crime, followed by an act in furtherance of that agreement. Then the judge turned to reasonable doubt. It wasn't an imaginary doubt, not a guess, not sympathy. It was a real, logical uncertainty based on the evidence or the lack of it. The jurors were reminded they could not consider news reports, they could not discuss the case with anyone, they could not use outside information. Their verdict had to come only from what they saw and heard inside that courtroom. The judge asked if the jury understood. Heads nodded. One by one, the jurors stood. They filed out of the courtroom quietly, the doors closing behind them with a soft click. Inside that room down the hall, there would be no cameras, no lawyers, no judge. Just 12 people, their notes, and the weight of a decision that could never be undone. Back in the courtroom, everyone else waited. Brian Draper sat between his attorneys, hands folded, eyes forward. Across the aisle, Cassie's family remained still, their expression unreadable. Time stretched. The trial was over. Now came the verdict. Hours passed before the knock came on the courtroom door. Everyone stood as the jury filed back in, their faces careful, unreadable. The room felt smaller somehow, the air heavier than it had been all morning. Brian Draper sat very still at the defense table, hands clasped in front of him. His attorneys leaned in slightly, whispering something brief, but he kept his eyes forward. Across the room, the family of Cassie Jo Stoddart sat shoulder to shoulder. No one spoke, no one moved. The judge took the bench and asked the question everyone had been waiting to hear. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreperson, a middle-aged woman, holding a folded sheet of paper, stood. Yes, Your Honor. The clerk stepped forward and took the form. The paper made a soft crackling sound as it was opened, a tiny noise in a completely silent room. On the charge of first-degree murder, we, the jury, find the defendant Brian Draper guilty. There was no gasp, no sudden movement, just a deep, collective stillness as the words settled over the room. The clerk continued, on the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, guilty. Brian Draper's expression didn't change much, but his shoulders dropped slightly, as if something invisible had finally landed. The judge thanked the jurors for their service, their voices, their attention. They were dismissed, filing out past the same benches they had sat in for days, their part in the story finished. But for everyone else, this wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of the final chapter in the courtroom. Sentencing. Now the courtroom shifted into its final phase, quieter, but no less heavy. The trial had answered what the jury believed happened. Sentencing would decide what would happen next. Weeks later, the courtroom filled again for the sentencing of Brian Draper. This time, there was no jury box in use, no witnesses waiting to testify about evidence. The facts of the case were no longer being debated. The verdict had settled that. Now the focus turned to consequence. Cassie's family sat together near the front, holding prepared statements. These were victim impact statements, a chance to speak about who Cassie Jo Stoddart had been and what her loss meant. One by one, they stood. Their voices sometimes shook, sometimes broke, but they spoke about the birthday that would never come, empty chairs at holidays, a bedroom that would never change. They didn't talk about evidence or legal definitions. They talked about a daughter, a friend, a life that had stopped at 16. Then the defense spoke. Draper's attorney reminded the court of his age at the time of the crime. They spoke about the possibilities of growth, of change, of a life lived in custody that could still hold reflection and remorse. They asked the court to consider that the person standing there was still young, still developing. Brian Draper was given a chance to speak. In moments like this, defendants sometimes offer apologies or reflections. Whatever he said was brief, directed towards the court and the family, and carried the weight of the verdict that had already been decided. Finally, the judge spoke. The courtroom went completely still. The judge described the seriousness of the crime, the planning involved, and the impact on Cassie's family and community. They acknowledged Draper's age, but said the nature of the offense could not be overlooked. Then came the sentence. Life in prison. The words echoed softly in the room. Final and irreversible. Under Idaho law at the time, the sentence meant decades behind bars with very limited possibility of release. There was no cheering, no dramatic outburst, just the quiet reality of a decision that would shape the rest of his life and could never undo what had happened to Cassie. With that, the courtroom chapter of Brian Draper's trial came to a close. But the story did not end there. Another trial was still to come for Torey Adamcik. Brian Draper's trial ended with a life sentence, a legal conclusion to one part of a tragedy that began in a quiet home on an ordinary night. But this case didn't end in that courtroom, because Brian Draper was not the only teenager charged. Another trial was still ahead. Another jury, another set of arguments about responsibility, influence, and intent. And that story, Torey Adamcik's trial, would unfold differently, raising new questions the first jury never had to answer. We'll explore that in the next part. If you found this deep dive thoughtful and respectful, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss part 2. I'll continue covering this case with care, accuracy, and respect for everyone affected. Thank you for spending this time learning about Cassie Jo Stoddart's story. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other. Bye bye.